He stumbled back into the lumberman's camp, clothing torn, heart pounding, and out of breath. The large, horned, blackish beast with spines that ran down its back and skin like a frog had chased him through the woods, only stopping right before it reached the glow of the campfire. It was in this moment that he knew the world needed to see this monster for what it truly was, and he was about to make it his mission to reveal the beast to the townspeople of Rhinelander, all of Wisconsin, and eventually the world. But before we begin, if you love cryptids and want to learn the full story, both the legends and the facts delivered as a narrative story, then this guided tour is for you. Lumber on over and tap that subscribe, like, or review button, depending on where you watch or listen. Oh, and be sure to stick around to the end to find out on a scale of fact, folklore, or fraud where this cryptid falls. Now, grab your axe, a pair of boots, and a flannel shirt. The tour is about to start. I'm Cody, and you're touring cryptids across the Atlas. Have you ever heard someone repeat a piece of information you knew was a lie? You ask yourself, how on earth could people believe this stuff? I mean, come on. From the outside looking in, the truth seems obvious, but to the person on the other end, these beliefs are as real as you or I. When we surround ourselves with an idea and read or hear it spoken over and over, we often begin to believe it. Businesses, politicians, terrorists, and angry family members over holiday dinners have long used this tactic to alter people's ways of thinking, influencing them to believe their version of the truth. One extreme version of this, I'm sure you've probably heard of, is called brainwashing. By injecting radical ideas and constantly applying mental pressures, the brainwasher can influence their victims' beliefs by confusing their thought processes and pushing on their emotional state. This is also often done under some form of physical duress, causing their mental walls to fall more quickly. And then on the other side of the emotional dark arts, you have subliminal messaging, the idea of sneaking in subtle imagery and ideas into everyday life to nudge people toward a certain mindset or idea. And then you have more accepted forms of mental molding. Pick your favorite news station, and watch it for a few days. Take a mental note of how many times you hear the exact same messages being echoed from the ads to the comments and even the headlines. You might just find yourself picking up a new worldview, one less your own than you probably realize. And don't even get me started on short-form video and the algorithm echo chambers we subject ourselves to daily. Let's just say, I'm a lot happier now that I limit my social media time and remove those apps completely from my phone. The truth is, we can all, and most likely have all, fallen into what's known as the illusory truth effect. We hear something repeated so much that we actually start to believe it, even if we know it's not true. But what if an obvious lie was shared so much that a group of people started to believe in it, and then somehow, maybe even through their beliefs, that lie started to come to life? Well, if the tales of the Hodag are to be believed, this hoax crawled right off the pages of folklore and out of the minds of believers into the swamps of Wisconsin, where it has terrorized the townsfolk to this very day. The Hodag, or if you're from the Great Lakes region, Hodag. An angry brute of a cryptid that has stolen the hearts of thousands, well, metaphorically at least. Described by folklorist Charles E. Brown as a ferocious beast with horns on its head, large bulging eyes, terrible horns and claws, a line of large sharp spines ran down the ridge of its back, and a long tail. The monster is said to be a dark blackish, maybe slightly green color, claws and horns ivory white, and when it slept, it did so standing up and leaning against its favorite tree, for it couldn't lie down. It was said to primarily eat mud turtles, water snakes, and muskrats, though it did not disdain human flesh apparently. Now, from as far as I can tell, the first mention of a Hodag, at least in Wisconsin, traces back to around 1889 from a paper titled The Pickingad. On page 7, a story named The Hodag Was Sick details a tale of a young farmhand who approached a well-dressed businessman as he waited on his train. The young boy asked, "Sir, isn't your name French?" To which the businessman replied, "It is." Then the boy asked if he was the same man who was running a novelty show in Buffalo last March. the one that cost 25 cents to enter, and the man confirmed. The boy went on to tell the man he was there. He was drawn in by a big sign that claimed they had a live Hodag on exhibit. But when he paid and entered, having never seen a Hodag in person, he realized he's been subject to, and I quote, an infernal swindle. There was no Hodag at all. Oh yes, I remember, the businessman replied. The Hodag was sick for a few days. That must have been when you came. This infuriated the farmhand, and being absolutely upset for being taken a fool, he threatened, "Give me back my coin or I'll cut it out of your hide." To which the businessman hastily replied, "Well, but did you at least open the door?" The boy looked confused, stating he only saw one door, and it had an exit sign on it. To which the man replied, "Yeah, that's the one. The Hodag was resting behind that door, and the others that saw it told me it was the best they'd ever seen. It was at least as good as 4 Hodags rolled into one. I can't help it if you didn't bother to open the door." It seems the history of the Hodag goes a ways back. The way the story reads implies, at least to me, that the Hodag was an idea trickled through tales long before stories found their way into local papers. Maybe that's how Eugene S. Shepard picked up on the idea, a fancy collection of stories passed down from lumberjack to lumberjack after a hard day's work. But no matter if it were the verbal tales of the story recounted above that planted the idea in Shepard's mind, one thing is for certain: he took the Hodag and ran with it full speed, right to the printing press. Born in Green Bay in 1854, Eugene S. Shepard was as local to Wisconsin as any other good cheesehead could be. After spending his early 20s near New London, he found his way to Rhinelander in 1885, taking a job as a land surveyor for local lumber companies. As a timber cruiser, that is, someone who surveys the quality and quantity of a forest to assess its value, Shepard found himself in the good company of lumberjacks that had flocked to the area for work in its thriving lumber mills. But what made Shepard stand out wasn't his exceptional surveying skills. Not to say he was bad at his job, but what he was really passionate about, what he was a true professional at, was elaborate pranks. See, Shepard was an avid storyteller. Many recount how at any given time he could be found doodling sketches on napkins, business cards, or local paper advertisements. When asked about what he was drawing, he would often go into fantastical stories about, well, really, whatever came to his mind, often making up the tales right there on the spot. One of his most fantastic tales spun was that he was a personal friend with Paul Bunyan, a fictional lumberjack with a pretty big folklore fan base, mind you. One article goes into detail of the time he spent in Bunyan's camp, even recounting fond memories of Mrs. Bunyan calling them all to dinner via a makeshift whistle formed from a hole carved by a woodpecker in a stump. Later, Shepard started a mail-order perfume business, a new wild fragrance line sure to please the masses. But when the unsuspecting purchaser would receive their envelope and open it up, they would find nothing more than a chunk of moss, sprinkled with a little bit of fragrance. Later, during a bout of financial hard times, Shepard grew tired of dealing with creditors pestering his porch, so the next time one came knocking, he quickly rushed to the bathroom, where he bit off a chunk of soap, chewed it up, and then gargled with water, causing his face to erupt with foam. He then stumbled to the door, moaning and snarling, and as soon as the creditors saw his state of being, they literally ran off in terror for fear he had rabies. But Shepard's most famous tale of all was what brought you here today, a large ox-like beast with ivory tusks, horns down its back, and frog-like skin, a cryptid we lovingly know as the Hodag. Shepard stumbled out of the woods, clothes torn, heart pounding, and gasping for his next breath. Startled, the lumberjacks gathered around him to check and see what happened. Shepard settled down on a log, took a deep, calming breath in and out, and recounted the terrifying tale. Spikes all the way down its entire length of its body, with a fistful of needle-sharp pointed spears, and spikes at the end of its tail, fangs that would rival a saber-toothed tiger. It could rip out the belly of the biggest bear. Eugene S. Shepard sat trembling as he recounted his supposed encounter with the fiercest of critters, the Black Hodag. Eugene claimed that as he walked through the forest, the beast lumbered up onto a white pine log, looked across the forest at him, and then quickly began to propel its 300-pound body directly at him. Shepard ran with everything in him, catching branches and slogging through mud at top speed all the way back to camp. After gathering his composure and a change of clothes, he gathered a group of brave men to go and hunt down the monster to bring it to justice. And the hunt was apparently a success, because a few days later in October of 1893, the papers ran a story depicting how the brave lumbermen found and fought the beast. The creature put up a gruesome fight, but after a long while, they finally managed to kill the monster with a well-tossed stick of dynamite. And right there, in typical newspaper fashion, was a photo of the lumberjacks holding rifles and pitchforks up at a lifeless monster, reenacting the whole gruesome fight. But just because this Hodag had found its final fate didn't mean that it was the only Hodag roaming the woods, and Eugene S. Shepard made it his mission to prove it. He slowly stalked the hillside, watching as the monster groggily crept off into a dark cave. The horned beast let out a bellowing yawn as it drifted into the shadowy crevice in the earth. After months of searching, Shepard knew this was his time to act. He carefully tottered up over the hill to the mouth of the cave, where he placed his explosive, lit the fuse, and ran. Now, the commotion caused the beast to stir, but it was too slow to react. The explosion caused a cascade of rocks to tumble down, trapping the Hodag in its den. There wasn't time to waste. Shepard ran down to the rubble, found a crack just wide enough to fit a hand through, and got to work. He grabbed the 10-foot bamboo pole he brought with him and carefully unwrapped the sponge at the end that was tied on and dipped in chloroform. Then he rammed the pole through the hole and placed it fiercely against the monster's nose, where it soon flopped over, fast asleep. Shepard and his team removed the rubble and placed the black Hodag into a cage, where they then transported it back to his barn for him to study. Eugene watched the Hodag for months, learning how it behaved, and after some time, confident with what he learned, he began to share Hodag facts with the public via the local paper, specifically on ads for the Centralia Lumber Company. A free Hodag description with every estimate, one headline read. But Shepard had bigger dreams for his Hodag. It wasn't enough to just tell people about it. He wanted people to experience it the same way he did. And the best way to do that, you might ask? To sell tickets, of course. The line outside his barn would wrap across his property. People were desperate to shovel over 10 cents to finally see the mysterious Hodag for themselves. And a show they got. Onlookers walked away amazed. They would share stories of how upon entering the barn, they would hear growls, snarls, and hisses. Then, as their eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, they would make out a faint, spiny silhouette. The beast would thrash, and Shepard would rush to get the people out before they got hurt. He would then go back in to calm his beast. Many attendees even witnessed him stumble out of the barn sometime later, clothes torn and ragged from the ferocious encounter. Excitement began to grow, and word spread quickly. And with the fall fair season swiftly approaching, Shepard knew it was time to take his show to a bigger audience. Shepard circuited numerous county fairs across Wisconsin. Any given weekend, he would have around 5,000 people paying a dime to view the beastly black Hodag. And if you do the math, that means he was raking in around $500 or $16,000 a weekend adjusted for inflation. And hey, being honest here, if I can make $16K a weekend showing off a Hodag, well, let's just say my life would probably be one big Hodag hoedown. But all this attention came with its own price. The Hodag frenzy caught wind, and word of the monster drifted across state lines. Before Shepard knew it, he'd received letters from both P.T. Barnum, the famous showman from New York, as well as the Smithsonian Institute, desperate to get their hands on a Hodag. Couple this with the fact that his children were quickly growing fed up with spending their evenings making monster sounds behind a curtain and pulling ropes tied to a dimly lit wooden carving of some creature, and the gig was up. Shepard was forced to admit that the Hodag was nothing more than a cash grab. I'm sure, probably based off that short story published in the paper just a few years prior that we covered earlier. And sure, Shepard at first claimed that the Hodag tossed him to the ground, broke free of its shackles, and beelined its way back to the swampy woods. But after a bit of town panic set in, he kinda had to come clean. The Hodag and its horror streak was over. Shepard took his money, retired from the lumber industry, and purchased a resort on the edge of town where he could spend his evenings entertaining folks with tall tales over taller glasses. and the town of Rhinelander watched the Hodag slip off into history, never to be heard from again. Except, they didn't let that happen at all. Lumberjacks have been spinning up stories of mysterious monsters for as long as there have been trees, axes, and, well, flannel. Ever heard of the fearsome critters? It's a whole book of mysterious creatures that supposedly call North America, specifically the Great Lakes regions, home. These creatures are an integral part of American folklore, and man are they fun to learn about. We've even covered a few of them on this show before, and now the Hodag can join them. Oh, and as a real quick side note, if you're looking for a fun video just on these lumberwood beasts, check out Wendigoon's video titled The Fearsome Critters of American Mythology. You can find the link below. Now, sometimes these hoaxes slip off into obscurity, like the Abaguchi I covered just a few episodes back. Sometimes a good hoax becomes a bit more mainstream, like the Snallygaster, which just so happens to also be an episode I covered. But holy Hodag, Rhinelander just wouldn't let this one go. If you visit their website, explorerhinelander.com, you will see that their logo is in fact a Hodag print. Their slogan is "Live the Legend." They call themselves Hodag County, for crying out loud. They have a whole section that gives in-depth information on the beast. They have over 24 Hodag statues, the largest of which lives at their visitor center and is quite literally the size of a small bus. They have radio stations and school mascots and drinks and restaurants and tours and clubs and a country music festival that draws a crowd of over 25,000 people a day, with the past headliners including Garth Brooks, Glenn Campbell, Brooks and Dunn, Merle Haggard, Roy Clark, and Charlie Daniels, just to name a few, all named after the Hodag. So I guess that little prank pulled by Eugene Shepard has paid off for the town of Rhinelander. But here's the thing, if anything, the Hodag encounters of yesteryear, just like the Hodag itself, haven't faded into the history books. People still tell stories of Hodag encounters. But here's the thing, at least to them, they aren't tales to turn a buck, because apparently modern Hodag sightings are real. It was a nice sunny day close to dusk, she recounted. Desiree French, a local girl from Rhinelander, had grown up trekking around the woods just outside of town. It was always nice to get out into the woods, climb a tree, and just listen, she said. And side note, for those of you who didn't grow up in the woods, yeah, kids do this. Most of my childhood was spent around and often up in trees just enjoying nature. Now, apparently, she did this regularly, but this late afternoon, something was different. He had lots of spikes going down his back, 2 on his head and at least 15 going down to his back, French recounted. She goes on to show the camera that the claws were about 10 inches long on each paw. And yeah, you heard me right, I said camera. See, this encounter wasn't back in the 1800s or even 1900s, for those of us old enough to remember that decade, that is. This witness statement came from a fantastic documentary on YouTube by Real History in 2022. And this wasn't the only witness to come forward. Jerry Slidell, local tour guide, found his Hodag fascination with his supposed Hodag encounter. I was out in an area that was fairly wooded and swampy, Jerry shares, and as I'm walking through the woods, all of a sudden, I'm stopped short in my tracks because a smell assaulted my nose. The smell was so bad it would drive a skunk off a guff pile, Jerry recounted. I moved forward carefully, and I could see the apparition walking down the path. Its nose was flaring red, and all of a sudden, it sprung up on a log right in front of me. And that's when I saw the claws. Jerry said he very carefully backed away until he could turn and hightail it out of there. Then there's local artist Rod Umlauf. Rod recounts how he and his family would often come up to northern Wisconsin when he was a kid to go camping. Rod shares how one night they noticed a shape coming closer to their camp, eyes reflecting the red glow of the campfire. It had a horrid stench and seemed to be covered in horns. At first, Rod actually chalked it up to his uncle playing a prank, but after seeing his uncle's fear and how it had genuinely caught him off guard as well, Rod knew this was no prank. His uncle promptly picked up a rock and tossed it at the creature, causing it to scurry away. Rod goes on to share how just 10 years ago, he was out snowshoeing when he crossed a hill only to see a family of Hodags in the valley below. These encounters, coupled with local lore, have gone on to be a major influence in his paintings, which, by the way, are very good. Look him up. But if we back up and look at the bigger picture here, maybe a guy who offers local tours, a girl who goes to a school where the Hodag is their mascot, and an artist who paints Hodags aren't the best sources for Hodag sightings. I mean, the whole town basically took Eugene Shepard's lead and has absolutely ran with the idea of this thing. And sure, there are local stories of Native American Ojibwe people's beliefs in the Mishipeshu or water panther that some claim the Hodag might be, but honestly, I've done an episode on that too, and the overlap here is more one of convenience than any tangible evidence. Because, let's be honest, the Hodag might as well be called a hoax dag. That was a lame joke. But still, there's just not much here. So, on a scale of fact, folklore, and fraud, where do I believe the Hodag falls? Let's start with the easy one. For fact, I'm giving this one a big ol' 0. There's just nothing about this thing I find to be real at all. I can't even conjure up what people think they might be seeing out in the woods, unless it's someone's escaped pet ox. But for folklore, I'm gonna give this one 25%. While we can easily trace the modern love for the Hodag back to Shepard's articles and fair tours, the fact remains that the Hodag is an absolutely serious representation of modern American folklore. It's easily in the top 3 fearsome critters, and hey, it looks pretty cool too. And of course, there is the slim but true fact that Shepard didn't invent the word Hodag. Tales trickled around before he brought it into the limelight, which leaves fraud with a grand margin of 75%. As far as cryptids go, this is one of the most transparent hoaxes we've ever had. Historically on this show, that is. Many speculate the authenticity of the Patterson-Gimlin film, but the truth is, we'll probably never know if they faked it or not. But the Hodag, the man who published the tale, quite literally admitted it. But no matter the cryptid legend, I still love the insight we gain into people's fascinations framed with the magic of a little bit of folklore. It shows us how quickly folklore can adapt and find its way into our modern world. And if you've made it this far, that means you must love a good cryptid tale. And if so, you're in luck, because Cryptids Across the Atlas has 2 new shows that's about to launch. If you've tuned in on our YouTube page and you're already following along, great, they're gonna show up right here as a playlist. And if you follow the podcast, we'll be dropping teasers so you can follow those new shows wherever you get your podcasts. Now, I can't share all the details just yet, but let's just say that one of these is a casual cryptid corner for us to, share what we really feel about cryptids and to cover some cryptid news, while the other is a narrative story-based show centered around actual cryptid encounters throughout history. So if you love cryptids and want to keep up to date with everything we have coming up, be sure to follow us at The Cryptid Atlas on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and even now, over at our brand new Reddit page at r/The Cryptid Atlas. And as always, thank you for touring Cryptids Across the Atlas. And remember to keep your eyes open. You never know what you might see just on the edge of the road.